the last remaining topic to discuss about the Industrial Revolution is the extent of industrialization. How fast or how quickly did it spread? Where did it spread? Where did it have its greatest impact? There are various ways that historians have tried to understand or measure industrialization. We're going to look at a couple of them and see how limited in the 19th century, particularly at the beginning of the 19th century, industrialization was. So, for example, engines are at the heart of the Industrial Revolution. Steam engines drove industrialization. But how easy was it to get your hands on a steam engine? Well, before you have a steam engine, you have to have engineers, people who build and manage these machines. To set up a shop to build steam engines would cost about 500 pounds. So what does that mean? We have to have a context for understanding what it would mean for someone to accumulate, right? You have 500 pounds in order for this investment, because this is a capitalist endeavor. You're going to invest at a risk in order to make a profit. You need 500 pounds just to start the shop. So how can we imagine money? What would be its value? Well, subsistence around 1800 was about 5 pounds. It would take 5 pounds for a single person to live for a year. Food, clothing, shelter. 500 pounds is a lot of money. For people living at subsistence, this was a lifetime of earnings. An agricultural worker, depending upon whether they were unskilled or skilled, somewhere between 20 and 30 pounds was their earnings for a year. So once again, we're talking about them having to live or work a lifetime, not just earning this money, but then they're going to spend 5 to live, right? If that's all they're doing. So an agricultural worker is not going to have the ability to create savings and put this aside. A bricklayer, a skilled urban worker, earning 22 pounds a year. An engine shop, someone who actually worked in one of these shops, they would get 39 to 52 pounds a year. So this was actually a pretty good job, because there weren't a lot of people who were mechanics at the time, right? It's a whole new field. But the most prestigious jobs were still traditional, right? A breeches maker, someone who made breeches. Here's a pair right here, right? The Buster Brown look with the silk stockings, because their customers are aristocrats and they want to deal with high class people or higher class people. So they're willing to pay for a tailor. So someone who is a tailor earning 68 pounds, 3 times what an agricultural worker makes, much more than subsistence. They would still take, right, just 10 years to accumulate or to earn enough to start up a shop. But if you're going to be a breeches maker, you're going to take that money that you're earning and you're going to put it into your lifestyle. You're going to have to wear better clothes to attract better people. You're going to have a better shop to attract better people into your shop. So once again, this is a barrier to entry into the field of mechanics. Other historians have tried to use coal as an indicator of the Industrial Revolution, because if you look at most of the statistics, it will show that coal usage dramatically increased in the 18th century and certainly in the 19th century. Well, how was coal coming out of the ground? Was it industrialized? Did they use machine? Or was it a craft economy? And the answer is that very simple. It was a craft economy. Coal came out of the ground with a pit of about 80 men, women, and children digging in the dirt with shovels and picks. So on the right-hand side shows a diorama from the Deutsche Museum in Munich that illustrates how even in the late 19th century, coal came out of the ground. Men were crawling in a coal vein, scraping it out, and then on the left-hand side showed how children, boys, loaded that coal into wagons and moved it out of the pit, right? This is all hand harvested, hand uh, dug out of the ground and moved by hand, right? There's no industrialization part of coal. So just because you can measure the increase of coal production, this doesn't mean industrial production, because we have to look at what were the uses for coal. Obviously you would use a coal for a steam engine, but steam engines aren't available in the 18th century. They only become available in the 19th century and widespread use in the late 19th century. Most coal was used for home heating and home cooking. There weren't enough trees. And when people moved into cities, they still needed to cook. They still needed to heat their home. And so they had a coal box. Didn't have a wood fire. Railroads did start in the early 19th century, but even the name for railroads gets lost in the history of railroads, because here is a railroad car, once again from the Deutsche Museum. And you see down in the bottom, there are wooden rails. And the cart had a pin that sat between the two rails to keep it moving in a straight line. These were used in a coal mine, right? So railroads were used in coal mines for rail cars. But the engine that drove that railroad was a human being. After it got out of the ground, it would be pulled by an animal, a horse, a mule. So even moving the coal around didn't really spur, in the early 19th century, industrialization. Only when you start moving past the 1820s did you actually have some railroads. And here we have the rocket, the first working locomotive. It has all of the characteristics of what we need for a railroad. Iron rails replace the wooden rails, an iron machine, iron wheels, the boiler, the piston, all condensed and can pull and move bulk items. When this machine was developed, it was mainly to move coal, but this is not till the 1820s, 1830s. The big move in coal production started happening well into earlier in the 18th century, when everything was done still by horses and humans. Also, another early 19th century invention then was paddle boats. The steamboat, a flat bottom boat used for rivers and lakes. And it did make incredible headway of being able to move product inland on rivers and lakes and canals. But steam didn't work for the sea until the late 19th century. All the way through the 18th century, wind still beat steam until the late 19th century. Paddle boats were good for rivers, they were good for lakes, they weren't good for open ocean. So when we look at coal usage then, right, coal usage does go up in the 19th century, but in the early part of that 19th century, it was still, for very traditional reasons. Only when you start going further and further into the 19th century does it become revolutionary. Another way of looking at the extent of industrialization is to focus on the textile industry, which I said was driving innovation in the 19th century. The heart of that textile industry was Lancashire, England. Right? So the big question is, okay, if this was the heart of the Industrial Revolution, how fast and how quickly was industrialization happening in Lancashire? There's a couple of ways to measure that. Well, first is machines. So of the 25,000 power looms, of 500,000 looms altogether. So 500,000 total looms, only 25,000 of those were power looms. The difference is the power looms were outproducing the hand looms. The workforce, even as late as 1841 in Lancashire, was only 14% of the workforce, which meant that people were doing other things besides simply working in a factory. So while factory life was obviously a growing part of life in Lancashire, it was not taking over everything all at once. If you look at horsepower, right? 30,000 horsepower was coming from steam, but only 10,000 from water. Steam power could produce more than water power. Not only that, steam power works all year round. As long as you can keep putting coal in it, it's going to keep working. Whereas the flow of the water is going to vary from season to season. The average factory in Lancashire had 45 horsepower with 12 horsepower per engine, which meant that each factory had to have 2 or 3 steam engines, and we've already seen the startup costs for this, so that there was a limitation on the amount of steam power that could drive those power looms. The big change here, though, is productivity. The power looms with the steam engines are increasing the productivity per human. Well, what about the workforce? Who's working in these factories in Lancashire? 40% of the workforce were women. If they were skilled at their job, right, skilled workers, they could earn 29.5 pounds a year, which is clearly above subsistence, right? They're not just getting by, but they're doing okay for themselves. Children, though, made up 50% of the workforce. And the reasoning here is, right, children don't have to raise a family. And so children were earning 8.5 pounds a year. There's no work regulations, there's no safety regulations, there are no pay regulations. Children working outside of the home. Children have always worked, but what's special about the Industrial Revolution is that children were working outside of the home under the supervision of a stranger. They weren't working under their mom or their dad or even their uncle or grandpa. These are young boys and girls having to go to work whenever the sun comes up and come home when the sun goes down, and they were working outside of homes. An unskilled family altogether, right? If you take an entire family, unskilled, they're earning 27 pounds a year. So a family of 4 earning 27 pounds a year, which means that they are living about at subsistence, just a little bit above. They're able to pay the rent, they're able to buy their food. But in order to do that, in the summertime, they could be working 19 hours a day and could be fired at the drop of a hat in an unsafe work environment. So this is Lancashire. But remember, this is 14% of the workforce compared to people still working in other things. So what do we get then? This industrial experience is horrible for some people, but it does not overtake the entire English economy in this giant wave. Lancashire leads the way. It does happen in other parts of the country, but it doesn't happen all at once. This is 1840, and it's still only 14%. The factories do dominate the skyline. They do dominate life because they're billowing out smoke, but it's not the most common experience. It's still an extraordinary experience, even in Lancashire. Another way of looking at industrialization is if we try to measure it in some way. And so here we have per capita levels of industrialization. Per capita means by head, by population. This table is from Paul Kennedy's Rise and Fall of the Great Powers. He wrote it in 1987. It's looking at the relationship between economic and military might. This index is calibrated towards England or the United Kingdom in 1900. So on the far right-hand side in the red bubble there is 100. This is the measure to have a compare and contrast of England or UK over time, as well as other countries. So the 100 doesn't, quote, mean anything except it's the benchmark created by economists to measure change over time and over place. Right? So if we look at England, right, this, or the United Kingdom, this one row, we can see that there was some industrialization around 1800, right? 1830, you get a doubling, and then 1860, double again. And it's not until the end of the until you get to 1900, end of the century, that you get to 100. Now, historically speaking, this is a pretty rapid change, but it takes 3 generations in England to reach what the economists there level at 100. We can then also compare that to other parts of the world. So Europe as a whole, with first line, 8, 11, 16, 24, 35. So compared to the rest of Europe, the UK is leaping far ahead with industrialization. Even places like France are nowhere near English level or UK levels of industrialization. At the end of the century, they're still at 39. Russia, 15, right? Now, over the course of the 19th century, they did double, right? They went from 6 to 15. But that doesn't put them anywhere near where they need to be to compete with British industrialization. The Germans got to 52%. The Habsburgs, right, are 52. The Habsburgs at 23. The United States at 69. Right? So at the end of the 19th century, the United States was adopting industrialization. It was keeping up with mechanization. But on the other hand, you look at China, and China actually drops in per capita industrialization. It goes from 6 to 3. Well, what's happening here? Well, Chinese population rises dramatically, just like every place else in the world in the 19th century, but it doesn't adopt any more mechanization. And so, relatively speaking, China falls farther and farther behind in the West, even though if you look at the beginning of the 19th century, right? Europe as a whole was 8, France was 9, Russia 6, Germany 8, Habsburg 7, United States 9, and China was 6. It's right there along with everybody else. But Chinese, Russian, German, or Chinese, Russian, Habsburg political leaders all made a conscious political choice not to adopt industrialization, not to adopt modernization, because they saw it as disruptive. Now, we know the rest of the story in the 20th century. They pay a price for that. The Russians pay a price, the Habsburgs pay a price, the Chinese pay a price. That industrialization is the way to military might, right? It's the way to the rise of being a great power in the 20th century. We can also then look at this from the perspective of relative shares of manufacturing. The relative shares of manufacturing takes 100 total, right? 100% of all manufacturing, and then divides that among the world. If we look here at 1800 again, right? This first line right there, up and down, you'll see that as a whole, Europe produced 28% of world manufacturing in 1800. China was at 33%, right? China has a much larger population. It's producing manufactured goods, porcelain, silks, in the early 19th century. It's doing pretty well as a percentage of world production. UK is only down there at 4.1, but then let's compare and contrast what happens between the UK and China, right? UK goes from 4 to 9 to 19 to 22 to 18.5%. On the other hand, because China doesn't change, it pretty much just stays the same. It falls as a percentage of world manufacturing from 33 to 29 to 19 to 12 to 6. So that when we talk about this industrial revolution, if you can look at it per capita, or you can look at it as relative shares of manufacturing, either way, you can see that these are there's not uniform growth, right? All places are not speeding away with machine production, either in the 19th century or uniformly across Europe or uniformly across the world. The two major benefactors of industrialization are the UK and the United States, right? Those Anglo countries adopt it, they run with it. Not far behind them are the Germans. The Germans in the late 19th century understand the power, the military might associated with industrialization, so they're adopting it. We know the Japanese follow the German model, but the big traditional powers, the Russians, the Habsburgs, the Chinese, don't see a value in change, and they stick with what they have. This eventually then changes the balance of power in Europe and in the world, where the British and the Americans become dominant forces in the late 19th, early 20th century, and then fast forward into the 20th century, and the United States becomes one of the dominant superpowers in the 20th century. The Soviets, dominant superpower in the 20th century. What does that? Adopting industrialization. So if we then want to, ask ourselves, what was the extent of industrialization? We have to ask two questions: when and where? It's not uniform. It is not consistent across Europe or across the world. the extent of industrialization happened rapidly in localized areas, but most of the world, right? You get the big populations in Russia, in China, in the Habsburg Empire, they had industrialization had very little impact on their life at all.